Sleep Sayer welcomes you. Dear listener, tonight we journey to the cherry blossom tea house. In a small village nestled within the rolling hills of the countryside, where morning mist clung to ancient tile roofs like gentle memories, there stood a humble tea house that had weathered countless seasons. The wooden walls, darkened by time to the color of honey, held the whispered stories of 3 generations. Its aged sign, hand-painted with delicate cherry blossoms, swayed ever so slightly in the spring breeze, each movement a quiet reminder of the careful brush strokes of Grandmother Moon, who had first opened this sanctuary of serenity decades ago. Minji's mornings always began in the same gentle rhythm, a dance learned in childhood and perfected through years of devotion. As dawn's first light painted the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold, she would slip her feet into well-worn slippers, their soft padding against the wooden floors echoing the heartbeat of the house itself. Each morning, she would pause at the threshold, just as her grandmother had taught her, to offer a small bow of gratitude to the space that had sheltered so many stories, so many quiet moments of connection. The memory of her grandmother seemed especially vivid in these early hours. Minji could still hear her voice, soft as silk, teaching her the sacred art of tea preparation. "Listen to the water," she would say, her weathered hands guiding Minji's smaller ones. "Each tea has its own story to tell, and the water must be ready to hear it. For green tea, it should sound like rain falling on autumn leaves. For oolong, like a mountain stream in spring." Mrs. Lee, who had been coming to the tea house every morning for 40 years, was more than just a customer. She was the keeper of village memories, a living bridge between past and present. Her usual seat by the eastern window had worn smooth from decades of quiet contemplation, and the morning light seemed to seek her out specifically, casting a gentle glow around her silver hair like a halo. "Your grandmother," Mrs. Lee would often say, warming her hands around her favorite celadon cup, knew exactly which tea would comfort a troubled heart. "When my son left for Seoul, she served me desert blossom tea, saying its subtle sweetness would remind me that even in parting, we find unexpected gifts." She would pause then, taking a slow sip, her eyes distant with memory. She was right, of course. She always was. Young Mrs. Kim, who ran the flower shop next door, would bring fresh seasonal blooms each week, arranging them with careful attention in the alcove near the entrance. "My grandmother taught me the language of flowers," she would say, her gentle hands arranging pine branches in winter, cherry blossoms in spring, lotus in summer, and chrysanthemums in fall. "Just as your grandmother taught you the language of tea." The village was changing, as all things must. Modern cafes with bright signs and elaborate coffee machines had begun to appear in the nearby town, their windows filled with pastries arranged like jewels and young people tapping away at laptops. But Minji's tea house maintained its quiet dignity, like a wise elder who knew that some things were worth preserving. Yet lately, there had been whispers of development plans, of modern buildings replacing the old, and Minji would often lie awake at night, the moonlight streaming through her window as she wondered how to protect her grandmother's legacy. One particularly misty morning, as the cherry blossoms were just beginning to unfurl their delicate petals, an unexpected visitor arrived. He was a young man in a crisp business suit that seemed at odds with the tea house's worn wooden chairs and hand-painted cups. His name was Junho, and he carried with him a briefcase and an air of city sophistication that made Minji's heart flutter with an unexpected nervousness. But there was something in his eyes, a gentleness, a searching quality, that reminded Minji of the way her grandmother used to look at people, seeing past their surface to the stories they carried within. As he settled into a chair near the window, the morning light softened the sharp lines of his suit, and Minji noticed his shoulders relaxing, as if the tea house itself was embracing him. "My grandmother used to bring me here," he said softly, his eyes taking in the unchanged interior with a mix of wonder and nostalgia. "She always said your grandmother made the best quince tea in all of Korea." He smiled then, a gentle expression that transformed his whole face. "I was very young, but I remember the way the steam would rise from her cup, and how she would close her eyes with each sip, as if she was drinking in memories along with the tea." Days passed into weeks, and Junho became a regular visitor, arriving each morning just as the mist began to lift from the hills. Mrs. Lee watched his gradual transformation with knowing eyes, noting how his crisp suits gave way to softer sweaters, how his hurried city pace slowed to match the gentle rhythm of the tea house. She began to share stories with him, tales of the tea house's history that made Minji pause in her work to listen. "Your grandmother and Minji's grandmother were friends," she told him one rainy afternoon, when the sound of drops on the tile roof created a meditation of its own. "They would sit right here, sharing dreams over cups of plum blossom tea. They believed that every cup of tea was an opportunity for connection, for understanding." One morning, Minji found a notice in her mailbox, sleek and corporate, speaking of progress and development. The developer wanted to buy the entire street, to replace the old buildings with something modern and efficient. The paper trembled in her hands like autumn leaves in a strong wind, and for a moment, she felt as lost as she had when her grandmother first fell ill. When Junho arrived that morning, he found Minji silent, her usual warm smile replaced with worried eyes. The kettle's gentle singing filled the silence between them as she prepared his usual quince tea, her movements speaking of the comfort found in familiar rituals. "What's troubling you?" he asked, his voice gentle as morning mist. As Minji shared her fears, Mrs. Lee spoke up from her corner, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through years of watching life unfold over countless cups of tea. "I remember when your grandmother faced something similar, Minji. It was before you were born. The world was changing then too, but she understood that some changes strengthen our roots rather than uproot them entirely." Junho's eyes lit up with an idea, and Minji recognized in them the same spark she'd sometimes seen in her grandmother's gaze when she'd found the perfect tea blend for a troubled soul. "What if," he said carefully, setting down his cup with a soft clink that seemed to punctuate the moment, "we could find a way to preserve the old while embracing the new?" Together, they began to weave a plan as intricate as the patterns and steam rising from a teacup. Junho used his business knowledge not to change the tea house, but to protect it. He helped Min-ji apply for historical preservation status, gathering stories from longtime customers about how the tea house had been a constant source of comfort through war, peace, hardship, and joy. Mrs. Lee rallied the other longtime customers, each sharing stories of how the tea house had touched their lives. Young Mrs. Kim spoke of how Grandmother Moon had served her mother marriage proposal tea, blessed with wishes for happiness that seemed to have worked their own quiet magic. Old Mr. Park, the retired schoolteacher, recalled how the tea house had been a sanctuary during his first difficult years of teaching, each cup of tea giving him strength to face another day. As spring deepened into summer, Min-ji found herself sharing more of her grandmother's stories with Junho. In the quiet hours after closing, when the evening light painted the walls in shades of gold, they would sit together, sharing pots of tea and pieces of their hearts. "She taught me that tea isn't just about the leaves and water," Min-ji told him one such evening, watching the steam rise like memories between them. "It's about creating a space where people can find peace, where they can feel at home." The developer's plans changed, shaped by the community's voices and the tea house's newfound protected status. Instead of demolition, they agreed to restore the old buildings, maintaining their traditional character while making necessary repairs. The tea house would remain, its heart beating steady and strong like it had for generations. Slowly, young people began to return to the tea house, drawn by its authentic charm and the peace they found within its walls. University students would sit for hours, studying in the gentle quiet, their modern laptops looking somehow less out of place beside the traditional tea settings. Young couples would share pots of tea, their whispered conversations adding to the layers of stories held within the old wooden walls. Mrs. Lee watched it all from her corner, her smile as warm as sunlight through rice paper windows. "Your grandmother would be proud," she told Min-ji one morning, as they watched the cherry blossoms dance past the window like pink snow. "You've found a way to carry her legacy forward while making it your own." One morning, as Min-ji went through her familiar routine of opening the tea house, she found a small package wrapped in traditional bojagi cloth sitting on the counter. Inside was a teacup, clearly antique but lovingly restored. A note in Junho's neat handwriting explained that it had belonged to his grandmother, who had indeed considered Grandmother Moon's quince tea the best in Korea. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the last customers departed, Min-ji, Junho, and Mrs. Lee sat together in the quiet tea house. They shared a pot of quince tea, served in a mix of old and new cups, including the newly gifted family heirloom. The warmth of the tea mingled with the warmth of their companionship, and Min-ji knew that like the tea house itself, some things could change while their essence remained eternal. As night fell and the stars began to appear above the village, the old tea house stood peaceful and serene, its windows glowing with warm light that spilled out onto the street like a gentle invitation. Inside, the scent of chamomile and jasmine still lingered in the air, mixing now with the sweet tart aroma of quince tea, creating a fragrance that was both familiar and new. a perfect blend of past and present, tradition and growth, ending and beginning, all steeping together in the gentle quiet of the evening.